Hi, I'm Karen Hurd, and I'm here with our next edition of Asking for a Friend Live. And we are tackling a topic that is, I know, on so many of your hearts and minds right now. And it's a subject we have not yet addressed on Asking for a Friend, which is all about diversity hiring and how do you hire for inclusion. And I have an expert joining us today, Arthur Woods. And welcome to the show.
Thank you, Karen. Great to be here.
We're
Great,
it's
happy Friday.
Yeah, happy Friday to you. I really wanted to invite you on the show for a couple of reasons. One is I loved how your perspective on diversity is very broad and inclusive. And when you're thinking about this, I see that you're thinking about it in a bit of a different way than I hear some others talking about it. So I want to make sure that we get to that today. And you also have a new book out, which is filled with really practical tips. And at the end of every chapter, you're like, start here, start here. And we're all about real practical here on Asking for a Friend. So let me start by just asking you why. Why is this so important to you that you would take the time to do this much research and write this depth of a book?
Great question, Karen. I mean, for me, it starts with the fact that I'm a white cisgender man, but I'm in the LGBTQ community. And I started my career, really shortly after coming out, growing up in a rural town where, no one seemed to be in the LGBTQ community. And I was taught growing up that being gay was a sin. And when I entered my very first corporate job, really unclear of how I would even represent this aspect of my identity, I observed homophobia. And for the first part of my career was very, sort of crippled and felt pretty unsafe at work to be myself. And so the idea of not having psychological safety, of not being my full self, my full authentic self at work, was something that sort of stayed with me. And so it wasn't until I entered into an empowering organization and an empowering team that I felt safe. I felt like I could come out and be myself. And that transformation for me was so personally pivotal that I began to dedicate my career and my life to HR technology and how we research and innovate around building places where people feel a sense of belonging in their jobs. And I think, like you, really wholeheartedly believe that work is one of the most important aspects of someone's life today. We hold our jobs in such a regard. We look to our jobs for a sense of community. We look to our jobs for a sense of purpose. And if people aren't feeling a sense of belonging in their jobs, that has to change. So the events of the last year, I think, accelerated all of this, and that was what led us to do this research.
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry that you've had that really, really difficult experience. And I can see how it creates the passion to get it right, because it doesn't have to be that way. It should not be that way. So Aubrey, thank you so much for joining us. If you have a question, I would love to hear. Aubrey is doing some really important work in this arena. So glad to have you here. Okay, so I want to start with setting diversity goals, because you and I were chatting pre-show here, and you gave me a surprising statistic.
Yes. So some recent research by Josh Bersin identified that 76% of employers have not yet set diversity goals. And this was just from this last year. I mean, I think we would have thought right after so many of the events of the last year and so many organizations made public commitments to the importance of diversity, we would have seen that translate to goal setting. And I think this is evident, honestly, Karen, as to why many organizations haven't made progress on diversity. It's one thing to say this matters, we really want to see diversity improve. It's another to set measurable goals and outcomes and then bring those to life. So I think as we enter 2022, this is a powerful moment for us to say, how do we ensure that organizations are in that 24%, and we hope growing number, that have set goals, that are tracking progress and are making some real headway?
Great. What would you say to, so I know I have companies that we're working with right now who would read your book and say, this all sounds great. I believe in it. There's nothing in this book that I disagree with. And yet at this moment, my biggest challenge is I just got to get somebody other than white men on my senior leadership team. Where would you start with a diversity goal for an organization that's really at the infancy stages of this journey?
Well, Karen, it's such a good question. And, we find that the vast majority of organizations that have set diversity goals center them purely around representation numbers. And so an organization will say, we want, 10% improvement in representation by X date, or we want, X amount of representation by Y date, right? And it is, I think as we step back and think about what's the pathway to achieving diversity goals around representation, we've tried to introduce two different types of metrics in our work. One is think about our process-based goals. None of our diversity will shift if we don't actually change the systems that we employ every day. That the hiring process we've created, the talent infrastructure we've created for the teams that we've already hired to advance and to stay and to thrive. So we've said, first, set process-based goals. Look at every stage of our talent lifecycle to determine where we need to improve, where we need to, decrease bias, increase accessibility. So process-based goals, which you could consider to be really around equity. The second is around inclusion, and that is, if we look at the vast majority of organizations, very few own diversity outcomes. Another quote, another stat by Burson found that 12% of hiring managers are accountable for diversity hiring goals. So we look at this inclusion metric, which is how can we gauge the behavior of our team and the collective ownership of this work. And the more that organizations are democratizing the work and measuring that, the better that we're seeing this work become sustainable. So we would say inclusion and equity are equally important points to measure diversity.
So very important. So if you're just joining us, we're here with Arthur Woods, and we're talking about hiring and being more inclusive in your hiring practices. And one of the things that I thought was interesting was where you were talking about the brand and what does your company presence look like? And there were a lot of factors that were very subtle that could be sending a message inadvertently about your brand. So who's doing this well? What are some examples, and what are some of the subtle things? Because, I like even the stock photos, people are like,
Yeah.
I have diversity in my stock photos. And you say, well, be careful. So
Right.
anything you'd like to share there would be helpful.
Well, okay. So here's what I'd say. First and foremost, in a landscape, we're in the Great Resignation, the Great Awakening, whatever we want to call it, right? A record number of people are searching for jobs. In the United States alone, there are 10 million job openings, right? 8 million job seekers. There's still a complete mismatch. And so we know that job seekers have many opportunities. And we also know that job seekers and employees alike are holding organizations accountable in a way that we've never seen before. And it's so powerful. I think this is what the world needed, right? We feel accountability from our people. And that accountability comes to a point of authenticity. So when I, as a job seeker, go to the career page of an employer, and I see stock photos and I see a compliance statement that says we're an equal opportunity employer just because legally we have to be because we're a federal contractor, right? I don't get a sense from that career page that this is an organization that is authentically committed to diversity. It looks like it's performative. It looks like it's compliance driven, right? So the organizations that are doing this really well have thought about human beings that are applying to these jobs, right? How do we tell a story about why this really matters to us? And how do we highlight the individuals in our organization and their personal stories? So, one that Karen, I know you saw that we wrote about was this data company, Splunk. They're a data company. They're based in the Bay Area. There's no reason, on paper, they have to have a commitment to diversity, but they created this very powerful storytelling campaign called Million Data Points, where they told the stories, had individuals from their organization tell the stories of the million data points they represent and all the different diversity attributes. And I thought it was such a brilliant, human-centered way to tell this kind of story.
Very, very good. And then I have to Stitch Fix this statement, and I'm going to read it because I think this is one of the best practices I have seen on doing this well. So they on their website, during this middle of the pandemic, during all the social unrest, so much going on. And they said, authenticity and integrity are two of our guiding values at Stitch Fix. And we want all of our candidates to be able to bring their best selves forward in the recruiting process. We recognize that interviewing can be stressful in and of itself, and that the events and challenges confronting our nation are hitting some of us more personally and in more personal and local ways. In that spirit, our team is prepared to reschedule interviews if you need more time to prepare or just need time to focus and process events around us. We are also open to discussing additional accommodations that might help you participate more fully and confidently in this process. Right? You, okay, these people really care. If they're willing to start at that, they really care. And I think that, so tell me why you think that statement is just, it hit me. Why did it hit you so much you included it in the book?
Yeah. Well, I think part of this, honestly, Karen, is that again, getting back to this point of empathy, getting back to the realization that we're talking about human beings applying to a job. By the way, in the middle of a pandemic, which is not an ideal time to apply to a job. It's already a stressful process, we know. So I think leading from this position of really understanding the mindset and the needs of job seekers and how they're showing up to this process, and whether it's in the way that we're crafting an authentic story in our talent brand, or the way that we're, setting the stage for an interview, right? And really just meeting the person where they are and leading with, leading with empathy. These are examples. And what's great about each of these, by the way, is they didn't have to involve elaborate systems. They didn't have to involve overthinking complexity, right? It was really just about, intentional steps to go that slightly extra mile. And it made a huge difference, enough where, we were compelled to write about it, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's shift gears. And as we're shifting gears, I'll just mention, if you are joining us and you have a question, please, for Arthur, please let us know. I would be happy to answer your questions. So I want to talk a bit about job descriptions.
Yes.
And so I'll start with any standard advice that you have, and then I want to give you a sample of a job description, or what they were saying and what is wrong with that. But first, give us some basic advice here.
Well, it's a great question, Karen. And the job descriptions, this is one of these areas where, we oftentimes go into an autopilot mode in hiring, right? If we think about all the steps along the way, I want to hire for a role. Let me go find the first template. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. Can I find it on Google? Do we have another job description I can just repurpose? And we enter in this kind of autopilot mode. And what we're doing when we do this is, we're not necessarily being intentional about how do I reduce the unnecessary requirements that would actually prevent me from casting a wider net, the high credentials and these other things that could actually limit my pool. And how do I start to think about the essential requirements for this role that enable me to consider people of alternative backgrounds, unconventional backgrounds, right? So it's a very different mindset as we start thinking about, like, how do I focus on the essential skills and, in a way that enables me to cast a wider net. The other is around the language that we use. So the zeitgeist of job description, sort of editing has been, don't forget to remove gender coded terms. You shouldn't say the word aggressive because that's male dominant, right? So folks tend to know about this sort of gender coded terms. What we don't see a lot of organizations thinking about is the fact that there's a whole body of terms, jargon, buzzwords, acronyms that certain job seekers don't understand, right? And we need to make sure we're neutralizing those terms so that we're not, creating a barrier. There are exclusionary terms that certain communities don't connect to, that have been misused, that even have, questionable origins that we need to be aware of. And then we need to really write to minimize subjectivity and vague language. And so we've introduced, kind of readability, busting through jargon, buzzwords, acronyms, and being really mindful of these potentially exclusionary terms that could deter candidates altogether, in addition to the way that we look at gender-coded terms.
All right, I want to give you, so you say, all right, what's wrong with this? What's wrong with this job description? And if people want to comment in what they think is wrong with this sentence, that would be fun too. But we're looking for a dynamic team player who will go the extra mile in a fast-paced environment. I mean, on the surface, that sounds like somebody I would want to hire.
Sure.
So what's wrong with that?
Well, okay, so a couple things here. First of all, when we say a dynamic team player, like that might make sense within our organization, but that sends a very mixed signal. These are corporate cliche terms, right? And when someone says dynamic, is that a personality trait that you're looking for, or how do I look at the actual competencies that you're trying to hire for? Because dynamic could be a very subjective way of looking at a job seeker. When we say a team player, I mean, am I expected to be managing a team? Am I expected to be, collaborating with a team in a different way? Like, let's get really specific, because a team player, again, this gets to like a culture fit, personality, subjective view versus what is the actual expectation. When we say a fast-paced environment, that term alone has been known to deter folks of age diversity. And ageism, we know, is rampant across the workforce. We collaborate with AARP, and we found that when folks read things like fast-paced environment or is able to move at a quick pace, whatever, that really does have age discrimination potential, right? So we have to really get clear on, if the need is to balance multiple projects or be able to multitask in different ways, let's get really clear on what that is, right? So as you can see, on the surface, this could appear to be a very common, in fact, I see this sort of phrase all the time in job descriptions, but you start to peel it back and put yourself in the shoes of someone who reads it and says, oh my gosh, maybe this isn't the right organization for me. Maybe I'm not going to be welcomed here. Maybe I shouldn't apply because I have a couple other roles I'm reading that aren't giving me language like this, right? And that starts to become this problematic mindset that job seekers enter with.
And you used examples of words like ninja, and people are thinking that's cute, right? It makes it a little different.
Right. I've seen the word ninja. Believe it or not, Karen, just the other day, one of my team members surfaced a job description that also said, we don't want anyone, we're trying to minimize the China virus, like literally had referred to COVID as the China virus.
Oh my God.
This was a job description, right? So in many cases, folks are moving quickly, not thinking, sending a potentially exclusionary signal in the way that things are just being written,
Yeah. And you had some interesting statistics, especially since we're on LinkedIn Live. I'd love to. So you said 16% fewer women apply on LinkedIn. And this is just a statistic. It's just a couple years old. So why do you think that is? And how does that relate to what we're talking about?
Well, so a few things. I mean, one is that, certainly across the board, there has been, chatter that, many of the roles that are on LinkedIn or the way that professionals have been expected to represent their profiles on LinkedIn have not always been optimized for women. And a lot of this is even just the way that we structure a job seeker profile. And so, we found that, this is why you've actually seen some really great platforms arise that have been dedicated to women, because they've been able to even restructure the role itself. But there have been staggering statistics, honestly, Karen, that have shown that when and in fact, we reference a study that found that 78% of the time when a woman didn't apply to a job, consciously, it was because she read the job description and saw qualifications that she thought were basically out of reach. And a great example of this, Karen, a very tactical point, is we see a lot of organizations say, I want someone with 3 to 5 years of experience, or 3 to 7 years of experience for a role. And they put this range thinking, well, maybe we'll get someone at the top end and we'll just get the best folks. And what happens is, even though the 3 years is acceptable, there are a whole series of job seekers who read that and say, I'm at the lower end of that range, therefore I won't apply. So one of the best practices we recommend is remove the range altogether. If 3 is the minimum, say 3+ years, right? Again, it's just a very specific thing that if you're at the lower end of that, especially as an underrepresented job seeker, you may disqualify yourself.
And you're an advocate. I know this is controversial, and this conversation comes up on LinkedIn all the time. Should you post the salary ranges in a job description? And you say yes. Why?
So we believe it is best to communicate the salary range to a job seeker in advance. And that's for a couple reasons. One, we know that pay equity and pay inequity is very much perpetuated at the moment that someone receives a job offer, right? Probably for me, Karen, one of the greatest kind of eye-opening parts of this research project was all of the work around pay equity, the systemic origins, basically the downstream impacts across all of society around pay inequity. And the job offer, if you think about it, is the single moment in time when someone receives a job offer where we are setting a precedent, right? We're giving someone, we're either saying you're above your worth or below your worth, or you're at it. And if someone, for example, has not been communicated the salary range in advance, and then comes in and says, I was making this in my previous job, and it's way below what they should be making. And the hiring manager says, oh, great, well, we'll pay you that. They've perpetuated that pay inequity at the moment that job offer was given, right? So the power of communicating this range is that we bring people to a common, a common, sort of end-to-end range, right? And we make that transparent. And if someone's far below it in their previous job, then they're brought up, right? And there's no ambiguity, because we know that, basically white cisgender men are way more likely to negotiate. That has impacted why their pay is usually higher. And when folks aren't communicating that range, they bring in their historical inequity.
Yeah, I think that's very, very true and very important advice. So David is asking a question. And so I know, because we have been having this conversation with a number of the organizations that we work with, they're doing a deep dive into their diversity numbers, and they are finding we're hiring okay. It's just that we're not keeping them. And so, and I know we can't unpack that in, 7 minutes, but what would you, one or two pieces of advice, like where do you start with all of that?
Well, I think part of it is that we have to look beyond just our hiring. We think of this as a leaky bucket, right? When organizations focus just on bringing people in without accounting for the experience they have when they're there, they're not, folks aren't advancing, folks aren't feeling supported, folks aren't feeling included. And we know that this starts in onboarding. We do a lot of work and research around how to set someone up for success in their new job, because we recently did a study this last year and found that the vast majority of people start their jobs and aren't given mentorship and support in their first 3 months, and this includes underrepresented job seekers. So how do we expect someone to stay when we're not setting them up with support when they actually start their new job, right? So this is really where organizations have to learn to chew gum and walk at the same time. We're in this moment where it's not enough to just bring someone in. We have to truly make sure they're supported when they're there.
Very good. Thank you. And you offer a lot of additional detail in your book around the answer to this question. I want to talk about sourcing.
Yep.
Because you've got a lot of, I think, robust ways to think about that. And one of the challenges that I hear is, I am representing the community because I am living in the middle of Nebraska or in rural Texas. So I don't feel bad that everybody here looks the same. What would you say to an organization like that, and how could they broaden their views on sourcing?
Well, this all for us gets back to having a holistic view of what we mean by diversity, right? So first of all, many organizations, and as part of this whole process of researching, the mindset of different leaders, we're looking at diversity in a very myopic way. And they were thinking diversity is just about gender and race. And part of what we did, and as part of this, chapter 3 of the book was let's focus on the fact that across underrepresented and marginalized communities, we include people with disabilities, the LGBTQ community, refugees and immigrants, working parents, right? The formerly incarcerated community. So we spent time sitting down with leaders from each of these communities to understand their systemic barriers and to help leaders broaden, just their understanding of who is marginalized when we think about the hiring process today. So even in Nebraska, we start to account for the fact that, wow, 70% of the disability community on average in the state is unemployed, right? So how can we, even if we are not seeing great, maybe ethnic diversity here, how do we ensure that we're creating a pathway for people with disabilities? They are in every single community. And I think as we start to really understand all these different dimensions of diversity, we start to realize where there is a lack of representation across all of them. And so I don't really buy the kind of let's let someone from a rural town off the hook, because there are so many different dimensions of diversity. And then, of course, for these communities or for these organizations, we say, look, if there's ever a chance to hire remotely, it's where you can tap into, pools of talent from outside of your specific concentric circle. And we see a lot of organizations doing this and greatly expanding diversity because they're now able to, they're able to start thinking about how they reach beyond their local geography.
Great. So you mentioned working parents, and you had a number of ways to be thinking about how you could support working parents and be more attractive and help retain. What are one or two pieces of advice that you have there?
Sure. Well, the first thing is anytime that that an organization can have flexible work from home policies, that is a huge benefit to working parents. I think, for the disability community and for the working parents community, for the individuals who were able to work remotely, it was a huge win. As you can imagine, childcare was a major challenge as kids were having to go to school from home in many cases this last 2 years. The ability for a parent to be able to sit at their computer and then tend to their children was huge. At Matheson, we have at this point over a dozen working parents, and it's amazing. Many of them with young toddlers, and they're able to balance their careers with raising kids, right? And that's only possible because we're able to offer the flexible work from home options. We have to really be holistic and mindful of our benefits. I think healthcare and our comprehensive benefits for families are key, and we only saw this being accentuated during COVID. The final piece is there are small things like just creating an inclusive culture where we're not requiring everyone to be on camera every day. If someone we have a new working mom who is breastfeeding and has to be off camera sometimes. And if we create a culture where everyone's on camera and she doesn't feel safe to turn her camera off, that's really challenging for her. So I think we have to also be really just mindful of how we build psychological safety for working parents. We acknowledge that we need to be flexible in scheduling. We need to empower people to be able to sort of set their own precedent and not feel in an uncomfortable place because they need to tend to their kids.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, we only have a few minutes left, but we can't have a conversation like this without talking about interview bias, because
Yes.
you can have all the candidates coming in the door in a very diverse slate, and a lot of times you can even require a diverse slate, and yet there's still an interview bias. How do you train your team to not succumb to that?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Karen, because when leaders ask us if there's one area where we can really influence change, if we have limited capacity, where do you recommend we start, or where do we recommend we at least focus? And we say interviews. Interviews are what we call the main stage event of the hiring process. Mm-hmm. They are typically the most subjective and unstructured part of the process for many leaders. And it's usually where the decision is made and where you spend the majority of time with candidates. So there's so much built into that process. So the lack of structure, lack of preparation immediately leads to inequity. The best thing that we can do to if we have one thing we can change for leaders, I say schedule 10 minutes before your next interview to be mindful and intentional about what you're going to ask, what you're looking for, who this person is, how you will make this interview as consistent as the next interview for the same role, right? Mm-hmm. That is the litmus test. We should not be having this vastly different conversation with one candidate as we do for the next for the same role. We should be really honestly looking at the same qualifications. The conversation can go in its own direction, but we should have a similar conversation, and it all comes down to a little bit of preparation time to make that happen.
Mm-hmm. And if you spend the first 20 minutes of an interview with one candidate because you realize they are also a triathlete and you're having this whole conversation around that, and then other one, you jump right into business, and that's going to create a bias, I would imagine.
It does. Oh my gosh, you went to my alma mater and you were referred by so-and-so. How do you know them? And all of a sudden you realize you're having you're already creating inequity at that early stage. And so that's really why this structured approach, it saves time. Actually, there's this misconception that this costs a lot of time. It really doesn't. It's more about just being intentional.
Okay. Thank you. Well, we're at the top of the hour. So I would just ask if you have one last piece of advice, and then show us your book again. So
yes, absolutely. So here's the book, Hiring for Diversity. Folks can find this at hiringfordiversity.com. Please join us. We have a community of practice of leaders who are navigating this work together. We're all in it together. I would just say at the end of the day, this is just as much a journey for leaders as it is for their organizations. In fact, we say no organization drives this change without the leaders that are at the helm of it every day. And so for leaders who say, I get this, but my organization's not on board, or we're not moving fast enough, you have so much agency as any individual who cares about this work. And I think that creative permission is something we want everyone to feel every day, that you're not powerless. You don't have to wait for your organization to already start making tremendous strides in this work.
Oh, thank you so much, Arthur. You have packed so much wisdom into this half an hour. Really appreciate the time that you spent with us today.
Thank you, Karen. It's a joy being with you this morning.
Okay, so next time on Asking for a Friend, we have Andy Thomas and Jessica Schwaller, who are going to share some of their best practices of how do you help your leaders grow leaders. And they're going to be talking about some of the really important work that they've been doing at K-Force over the last 2 years to really make this happen in a way that has actually been fantastic for their culture and as well as for their end of, and at the end of the day, the results. So really looking forward to that. Hope you will join us on December 3rd. Thank you so much.